Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the final of our third sector digital leaders webinars. Now, today we are joined by Tori Ellaway of CAST, and we're going to be discussing user insights. Before I hand over to our host, Zoe, just for those of you who perhaps have only joined halfway through the series, or this is the first webinar, we've run 5 in total now. All of them are available on the School for Social Entrepreneurs YouTube platform. So just go onto YouTube, search for School for Social Entrepreneurs, and they're there as a third sector digital leaders playlist. Other than that, over to you, Zoe.
Thank you very much, Dave. We're really excited to be here today to talk about one of the most important topics in digital, particularly digital leadership, which is about how we can get to grips with user insights. And I'm delighted to welcome Tori Ellaway from CAST to talk us through this issue. Thank you very much for joining us, Tori.
Hi, Zoe, and hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's exciting to be here.
Good. Excellent. Very good. Very good. And obviously user insights is a real feature of the work that you do at CAST, particularly around digital service delivery, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It kind of underpins every single program that we run, really, and it's something that we definitely kind of recommend that people do at least at the very beginning of a project, but also beyond as well.
Brilliant. Great stuff. Excellent. So, Tori, I think you're going to talk us through the 3 key things that every charity leader should know about user insights before we go through some questions. So over to you, Tori.
Cool. Thank you. So I guess the top 3 things I wanted to talk about. So one is that I guess that trying to gather user insights, it should happen throughout at the very beginning of a project and throughout, and then also kind of beyond it as well. So just bearing in mind that it's something that's very, very important to do at the very beginning of a project, but continuing to do it later on is really important. And actually, we try and recommend organisations build it into their processes as well once they've finished a project. So trying to kind of make it a habit for some of your staff. So we've seen some charities who've actually incorporated user research into their staff's objectives. So saying, do, even if it's kind of just a couple of hours a month of talking to users in quite a structured way. But then also trying to find different ways that you can feed those insights back into your teams as well. So sometimes we've seen charities have strategy meetings where actually a lot of it consists of user insights, and it just kind of makes sure that there's a really nice flow of finding out about your users and then kind of making sure that builds into your policies and strategy as well. Then the second tip I think I would say is to initially start off very kind of broad with your research, especially if it's something new that you're doing. So I would say that doing user research it's all about finding out about how your users are living their lives, what challenges are they facing, what's the technology that they're using, how they're engaging with your services if they're already engaging with you. So it's just building a really, really clear picture of who your users are and what their needs are as well, so that you can then respond to those in some way. So that's kind of why it's quite useful to start off really broad. And then after a few interviews, you'll start to notice some patterns and themes that people kind of mention all the time. And that's when you can kind of pick which one you think is the most pressing to start to address. And then you can kind of delve a bit more deeply into that one, into that particular theme as well. So starting off really broad and then going in more narrow. And then I think my third one is to try and use insights and research to challenge some of the, I guess, the trickiest or the most ingrained of your internal assumptions that you might have about your users. So we often hear, and it's, we at CAST also have our own internal assumptions about our users as well. It's just something that kind of happens. But I think one of the things that we've heard as well is, especially working with charities that potentially whose beneficiaries are older people, that older people don't use tech. And actually going out and doing user research and asking questions about how people find out information or how they use technology, can actually challenge some of those assumptions and I guess help your organisation to have a clearer picture of who your users are.
Excellent, thank you, Tori. Yeah, so it needs to be something that's really ingrained in every organisation and their approach, as you were saying. What would you say to perhaps a trustee or a charity leader who's really sceptical about this stuff, who might say, well, why should we do user testing at all? How would you answer that question?
I think it's quite a useful way to, so if you think about all of the like I guess the apps or the tools that have been created within the charity industry, for example, that have kind of been some white elephants. I think we've all kind of probably all experienced those and seen things come out to quite a big fanfare, and it's going to be the next big thing, and then actually it comes out and it's not not used in the way that we were all expecting. So I think just trying to make them understand that if you do the research and you find out exactly how your users are living and how they're behaving, then actually when you create something that responds and fits in with those behaviors, you're most likely to it's less likely to flop, I suppose. So I guess from a risk management point of view, user research it's completely invaluable, really. So I think I'd probably approach it from that perspective, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and that's why users is obviously such a key principle in the code of practice. Yeah. So what's the best place to start with user testing, do you think?
So I would say that the first place to start is to, I guess, identify who your users are. Who are the people that you're looking to solve a particular problem for? And so it might actually be an internal problem. So you might need to talk to some of your staff or some of the frontline, people who are leading some of your services potentially. Or it might be a problem that your beneficiaries are facing, or that you think that your beneficiaries are facing. So you would try and talk to them. And actually sometimes you would ideally talk to both, I suppose. Because I think a lot of the time you can get quite a good perspective from both of your users, different sets of users. And I guess also it's maybe just acknowledging that you probably won't be able to solve a huge problem for everybody. So actually thinking about is there a way that you can narrow down the user group that you want to try and help? So you just trying to kind of focus on who's maybe kind of the most important or the most pressing subset of people. Because then I guess if you create something, or if you have an idea that works for that particular subset, then you can start to kind of broaden that out to wider audiences as well. And then I think, so once you've identified who those users are, it's just about lining up 5 interviews. So we always say start with 5 or 6 interviews. There's some kind of research out there by Jacob Nielsen, who's kind of like the godfather of user experience. And he found, through going through all of the research that he'd done through his career, that actually by talking to just 5 people, you can get 80% of insights. And I guess after that, you get quite diminishing results. So actually just going out and talking to those 5 people can give you some really, really interesting stuff, which you can then continue to delve into with I guess kind of more sets of user research after that. And then I think after that as well, so there's lots of things within this best place to start, but is thinking about, I guess, the things that you actually want to find out from your users. So one of the ways that we do that, and we help charities to start thinking about that, is to use a knowledge board. And so it's, I guess, on an A3 piece of paper, we put 3 columns down: what we know, what we think we know, and what we don't know. And actually mapping all of this out as a team exercise is really, really useful. You can kind of get everybody's knowledge and their assumptions down in one place. And then you can start to almost write an interview script, for example, that will go towards you finding out what are those things. You know, can you validate the things that you do know? Can you start to kind of find out more about the things that you think that you know? And actually, you know, can we find out a lot more about the things that we don't know?
Thank you, Tori. That's a really helpful summary of where to get started with this stuff, because it can feel quite overwhelming, I think, to some small organisations. So if you are on a really tight budget, suppose you're a tiny charity and you've not got much money or much time, what are the key things you think you should focus on in terms of user testing? We've talked about speaking to 5 people. Is there anything else that you would recommend if if you're really stretched in a small organisation?
I think going and also doing some observations can be really really helpful as well. So if there's any, you know, if you're running any services that you might be able to just drop into, I guess it could be quite helpful to see people how they're engaging with your services, and also, like, I guess just getting a general vibe of, you know, how people are interacting with each other if they're in a waiting room or that kind of thing. So observation is probably quite a good one to do as well. We also, I don't know if you've heard of guerrilla testing.
Yes, yeah.
So that's another way of doing some quite kind of quick yeah, they're quite quick interviews. So it might be that you go to a cafe, for example, and you just, you know, ask them a few quick questions. We also try and offer people a coffee or a cake or something like that in return. But that's also quite a nice quick way of just going in and getting some information, and that can then help you to, I guess, focus in on different areas that you might have heard.
Yeah, that's a great technique, guerrilla testing, isn't it? I'm starting to hear more and more charities doing that, because it's such a great way to observe people in their natural habitat, isn't it?
Yeah, it is definitely.
Brilliant. Go on. Sorry, go on, Tori. Go on.
I was just going to say about the tight budget. I think sometimes it just does really come. It's obviously the time constraints that smaller charities and most charities have anyway. But I do think that, you know, even if you spend an hour on it a week or something like that, you can really get some really fantastic insights into your users. So it's just trying to make time for it, which isn't easier said than done, I know, but
yeah, absolutely. But even, you know, as you say, even if just a small amount of time can yield such great results, can't it? And what other key things do you think that charities need to bear in mind when user testing?
So I think a really important thing to think about is the ethics of user testing as well. So a lot of the time, the charities that want to go out and find out stuff from their users are, you know, potentially dealing with vulnerable people. They might have been through some quite stressful or traumatic experiences, but actually finding out about those experiences it can be very helpful. So there's quite a tricky balance in finding out that information from people. So it's all about, I guess, thinking about where those people are, I guess, like where they're at, and if they're in a good position to be answering some of the questions that you might be wanting to ask them. And I think, you know, the charities themselves will be absolutely the best placed people to make that call anyway. So, but yeah, just thinking about that. And also, a lot of the time you might go off and do a user interview, and you'll find that the people want to talk to you about other things that aren't necessarily relevant to your to the topic that you're trying to find out. And actually, I think there also has to be a balance there as well, where, you know, you're listening to them about the stuff that they want to tell you, but you're also trying to get some information from them. So it has to be quite a nice balance, so that the user doesn't feel like they've kind of been exploited, or yeah, I think. And then I think also, like, it can be quite daunting initially when you're setting out to do user interviews and research. And I know for sure, like, my first few were pretty kind of daunting, but it is really important to kind of get out there and almost kind of just push yourself to do it, and and then once you get into a bit of a rhythm of it, I think it can actually become quite addictive as well. You can just get into the flow of it. So I think just, like kind of making sure that you push yourself to go out and do the first couple, and then it will get easier.
Yeah, you can learn so many useful things, can't you? I know exactly what you mean about how you just want to know more and more and more. So speaking of that, which charities do you think are building user insights into their work really well?
So I think so one of the charities that we finished working with quite recently at the end of last year was Disability Rights UK, and we did a fair amount of user research with disabled people, trying to find out about how they might want to share stories and about their experiences of discrimination that they kind of might experience out and about, or employment. And we ended up creating a form for them, for disabled people, to be able to submit stories of their discrimination. And now we've created a little platform for those stories to live, and there's been quite a lot of interaction with that. And now, so that was actually kind of one of the charities that I mentioned earlier. They started having policy meetings where they start to discuss some of the themes that they're noticing from the stories coming through. So I think that's a really nice example. And then I think also, I think another interesting example of a charity that we've worked with was one that we were helping them with their online booking process. And it was for paid for services. But the current booking service was really, really slow and clunky. But because they were quite unique in the services that they offered, and people actually, there wasn't really very many other places that they could go for those services, it wasn't seen to be too much of a problem. But actually, so we visited some of the users in their homes, and we took some videos of them using the booking system in the context of their lives. So they had like kids running around, they were like cooking and living really quite hectic lifestyles. And their feedback was very vocal about, how they were struggling to get this form filled in. And so we actually took those videos into a meeting with the senior staff and some of the quotes that we'd heard. And it really kind of was an eye-opener for them. That actually, if they didn't act on this, they would quite quickly start to fall further behind, especially with disruptors popping up and coming into the different areas of the charity sector.
That's such a good point. So how not doing that testing can have a real impact on your what you're trying to do and your purpose and your model as well. That's really powerful. Thank you. And are there any pitfalls in user testing which charities should bear in mind? What should they avoid?
So I think it probably avoiding and it's so easy to do, but asking leading questions. So I think the real value of user research is that actually, you will hear, you can hear some quite uncomfortable things sometimes, and it may not be exactly what you want to hear, but that's the whole point of doing it, I think. And so asking leading questions can often just validate the things that you want to hear, or people will just tell you that you're already doing a good job. So I think it's just trying to be really careful with how you ask questions and how you get as much information from those conversations as you can. And also, I guess within that is, people will sometimes be quite closed off. Like sometimes it can be quite difficult to get people to give you the information that you want. So just trying to delve into that with asking lots of whys and, can you tell me more about that? And so, just getting as deep as you possibly can. And also just bearing in mind that people will try to say things to please you or to not offend you, which is very lovely, but also it can not be as useful as you would like it to be. So I guess it can also be helpful sometimes. So if you are, if you're interviewing people that you as a charity you already kind of engage with and is maybe asking somebody who's slightly more removed to do the interviewing. So there's less of a personal relationship there, and actually they might be a bit more honest with you. And I guess actually that makes me think of another thing as well, which is to be careful with I guess, interviewing all of the same people, or people that you're already engaged with, so they already have a relationship with you. Because I think it's always good to ask people who you already know. But I think it can also be very good to try and access people who are outside of your networks, and to get a fresh point of view, and yeah, find out some slightly different things.
That's brilliant. Yeah, absolutely. So really thinking through the kinds of people that you're talking to, making sure they're not all just going to say the right things. I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I guess people are going to feel a bit less comfortable with giving difficult feedback about a tool to a charity, rather than say if it was, you know, Tesco and their online shopping, they'd have no qualms about saying this doesn't work. But with charities, sometimes they might be a bit more reluctant to do that. So as you say, it's about creating the right conditions so they feel comfortable about being honest.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tori. That was so insightful. So that's enough from me grilling you. We're now going to open the floor to participants to share any questions they might have for Tori. So Dave, are there any questions that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've got a question here about how can you ensure that you're asking your users the right questions?
Right. Okay. So I think it sometimes can be a bit of a trial and error process. So quite often, actually, you'll start off with one script, and then you'll go off and do an interview, and then you know, you'll often tweak that kind of every time that you do an interview, just because, you know, you may not get the answers that you were hoping for, or which actually sounds like then I'm trying to kind of make it a biased interview, but what I mean, you kind of just haven't the questions haven't worked quite to plan. So I think there's some trial and error in just being comfortable with adopting that and adapting it as you go. But I think it can also just be there's like a few kind of tips, I guess, in terms of like actually writing the questions and how you go about that. So, you know, making sure that they're not leading, making sure that you don't ask any questions that just have a yes, no, or maybe answer. So just rewording those slightly. And I think also just making sure that you don't include any jargon or, you know, things that your users may not understand within those questions. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers.
Yeah, and so Matt has asked a question which sort of slightly expanded it by saying, how do you avoid leading questions while still being narrow in focus?
Yeah, so I think you like, if you kind of avoid using adjectives like, you know, have you found, you know, how useful did you find this? Or I know it's obviously kind of depends on completely the context of the interview that you're doing. But I think it's just keeping questions really, really broad. So trying to ask, I guess, questions that are based in their experience, that questions that are broad and actually kind of gives them lots of leeway to explore through, I suppose. So just very open questions, even though they might be narrower in what you're asking them, but they can still be quite open. So I'm not doing a very good job of explaining that.
So not so yes or no answer. So would it be something like, instead of how useful did you find this, what did you think of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, something like that would be ideal. Yeah.
And Matt's put some other really good questions here. So he said, with several questions, very good, Matt, thank you. How do you begin to structure this? Do you develop the knowledge board before or after the initial 5 interviews? And should all first 5 interviews be broad or hone in on specific issues?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I would recommend doing a knowledge board first, just because it can really help you to actually decide what, you know, where you want to focus. And you might end up with 100 things on your knowledge board, and actually, you know, you can only focus on a few. So I would say start off with a knowledge board, and then pick out the key things that are important to you and your users at that time, and then start to structure your interview at that point. And then I think when you start to narrow down, there's no kind of real benchmark, unfortunately. So I can't say, by 3 interviews you might know everything that you need to know, and then you can start to do something differently. I would say try and stick to the same structure if you can, like maybe tweaking some of the questions within that for those first initial those 5 interviews. I would say stick to your initial interview script, and then beyond that, then that's when you can start to focus in on some of the themes that you will have seen.
Brilliant, thank you. So it's almost a bit like a funnel, isn't it? I suppose you start off quite broad and then beginning to build some assumptions, I suppose, out of those interviews that based on the themes, I think is what you're saying. And Matt's actually put a brilliant follow-up question here. He's put, how do you engage users and make it worthwhile beyond coffee and cake? I have to say cake would work for me every time. If you know me, it won't be a surprise. And then he's also put this really good point. Do you have a process for feeding back learned insights to your wider user group to show you're listening? So Tori, we'd love to hear your thoughts on both of those questions.
Sure. I'll answer the first one. So we don't have, so during interviews, we will often, at the very end, we'll add in a couple of questions, which are, do you want to stay involved? And if they know anybody else. So that's kind of another way of, if they know anybody else that we can talk to. So it's another way of like broadening out the research to people who might not necessarily engage with you as a service. But then it's also a really good way of finding out whether you are, whether they want to stay involved in the project, and you can then actually go back in contact with them. And generally speaking, if we've interviewed somebody or gone and observed with them and got some of their contact details, we'll and they've obviously consented, we'll then actually try and test out some of the ideas that we've come up with further down the line with them. And I think actually that can sometimes be quite an interesting process for them as well, and to feel involved and to feel like they've been listened to and heard to, and actually the feedback that they've given you has then fed into some ideas that are actually quite tangible, can really be actually quite a rewarding thing for some of the people that we've interviewed. So that, I guess, that kind of is a response to the first question that you asked, Matt, as well. But I do think it's one of the things that we're trying to kind of work out is, what's the quid pro quo, I guess, for doing user interviews and for giving your time. I know that like some charities have offered vouchers to people, so like actual kind of financial remuneration, which is obviously not a possibility for every single charity or project, and also I don't think it's necessarily a kind of a great way of doing things. I think there are other things that you can help out with, and I think often like the involvement in that process is enough. Cake and coffee sometimes is enough, but I think also I think there's other things that you can offer. So if you're running a service or an event, it could be that they come to that event and then you talk to them afterwards, or that kind of thing. So I think there are things. I think you sometimes have to be a bit inventive with the ways that you reward with your users with. But I think there's lots of different options.
That sounds good. So I suppose again it comes back to understanding your users.
Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And some great questions there. Are there any final questions which people have before we wrap up?
Tori, I've got a couple. One of the things that charities often struggle with is actually defining who their users are. And if you talk to them, they'll say, well, we've got 15 different user groups. They struggle to know where to start with actually, well, which users should we be asking, which should we be excluding from the research. I was wondering if you had any tips on how they could be more.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it can be useful to I guess there's probably a few ways of doing it. You could start to have a look at some of the analytics that you might have. So for any of like the online services that you might be running, just to try and find out, who are the people that are using that service, and then also you could talk to them to find out whether the services that you're already running are meeting their needs, for example. But then you could also have a think about, I guess, having a look at if you're running a helpline or any of the advice or information services that you might be running as well. Is, do you have a consistent set of queries that are coming through, and are you already capturing the data that you might need to find out whether that's a particular demographic who are asking those questions? If not, you could start to ask those questions and then build a picture of who those people are, and then try and meet those needs with a service that you might be able to. So you could interview them. I think it's kind of just looking, I guess, at the different things that you're already doing, or the different ways that people are telling you that you're not doing something that they need you to be doing. And if there's kind of some quite key patterns and things coming from that, it's trying to talk to those people. I don't know if that's answered the question. I feel like that's there's probably lots of different ways that you might be able to go about it, but it'll be quite kind of specific to the context. But
are there ever any occasions where with charities you ever think, well, sometimes instinct has to take over from insight? So the classic example that everyone always uses is the iPhone. Because when they first user tested the iPhone, everyone said no one wants it because it doesn't have a keyboard on it, and everyone wanted a physical keyboard. And Steve Jobs just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, and they released it, and it became the world's best-selling phone. And I was wondering, is there a case where if you're passionate about something, you might think people don't know they need it, but you really do, where you could just go with instinct over insight?
I think there's probably instances, that is a possibility. I think you'd probably want to try and test it. So I guess one of the things that we try and do is, so once we've done some user research and come up with some ideas, is that we'll then go out and test those ideas in a very small group. But then you could do a pilot, for example, which is testing, or a trial, which to test something with a small group of people just to see how they interact with it. And so I think that you could get some information from that, although you'd probably be taking a bit of a punt in putting it out in front of people. And I think I think there is starting small and there is involving your users, but I think there always has to be an element of ambition and aspiration and all that kind of thing. So I think, I think there are ways of doing it in a controlled way, because obviously, it's donor money or taxpayers' money, and but I think definitely there has to be kind of like a good balance of the two.
Okay, great.
Great, lovely. Well, thank you so much, Tori. It's been brilliant hearing about your very practical advice on how to approach user testing and how you can fold that into your work and make it part of your organisational strategy. And I think it's so important for us as charities to really model that behaviour to other organisations, because if we're not here for the people that we help and that we serve, then why are we here at all? So thank you very much for making that so manageable and also understandable as well. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Tori. If people want to hear more from you on your social media or CAST social media?
Yes. So I'm just trying to think what's our handle on Twitter. So I think we're Tech for Good. We are CAST. I think it's quite. But also, if you want to kind of email me for any questions or anything, I'm on Tori@wearecast.org.uk.
And are you running some design hops at the moment, Tori? I know you guys are doing some really great stuff around the country to help charities.
Yes, so we have been running a number of design hops up until I think today is like the last one of this tranche, but we will be doing some more from I think end of April onwards. So so if anybody's interested, you can go to wearecast.org.uk/design hops. And the new dates for that will soon be coming up. So sign up because the sessions are kind of really fun and insightful, and will kind of give you a really nice process to follow.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tori. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Dave, is there anything else you want to say? I know that a recording of this webinar and the others will be available, won't there, if anyone
will
be
available on our YouTube channel. So this is the final one of the series. So it's very kindly being funded by DCMS, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, through their Digital Leadership Fund. So I guess the only thing if you want more of them, I don't know, petition your MP or something, or we want more webinars, and we'll see where we can go from there. But no, just to take the opportunity to thank Tori and all the panelists that we've had over the previous couple of weeks, and to thank you too, as well, Zoe, for being such a capable host.
Oh, thank you. Well, yes, and a big thank you from me to all the panelists, to Tori today and all the others that we've had, and to DCMS and OCS for funding this work as well. And of course, to everyone who's come and attended too. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Lovely.
Brilliant.
Bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.